Good afternoon. My name is Bob Mockemer, and I serve here as the pastor, and I have the privilege today to have Rebecca's cell phone and, with Rabbi Mickelson's permission, reading his bio off the screen. Brian Mickelson is the rabbi of Reformed Congregation Oheb Shalom in Reading, Pennsylvania, where he served since 1998. Previously, Brian spent 6 years. You need louder? I'm going to get speech lessons today. So we're going to need volume upstairs, I think, because I can't adjust that. Rabbi Brian. In Reading, Pennsylvania, where he served since 1998. He spent 6 years in Melbourne, Australia. He was ordained at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio. Go Buckeyes. He received his BA from Franklin and Marshall. And in 2003, Brian earned a graduate certificate in healthcare ethics from Rush University in Chicago. In 2017, he was awarded an honorary Doctor of Divinity by the Hebrew Union College in honor of 25 years of service to the Jewish community. In the community, Brian is the Jewish chaplain at the Reading Hospital and a member of the Institutional Review Board. He is president of the Home Healthcare Foundation, a successor of organization of the Berks Visiting Nurse Association. He's vice president for Easy Does It, a drug and alcohol treatment program for the homeless, and the Jewish Federation of Reading. He has served as a member of the board for both Opportunity House and Berks Youth Chorus. I love that. Brian has been heavily involved in interfaith projects and dialogue in the Berks County area. He's one of the founders of A Common Heart, Jewish, Catholic, and Muslim Dialogue, for which he and his fellow co-founders were awarded the Franciscan Prize by Alvernia University in 2016. Holly is his wife, and they have 2 daughters, Naomi and Gabriella. He gets to work with Holly. She's the school director at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. Oh, that's where she graduated. That's where you met. Mm-hmm. How did you meet?
On the streets of Jerusalem.
On the streets of Jerusalem, for real? For real?
Yeah, absolutely for real. I can.
You've got it from here.
That sounds good.
But the members of St. John's Lutheran Church welcome you not only to this place, it's precious to us, but we hope that you'll find it a precious space as well. There are lots of people that will help you move from the sanctuary downstairs. How many of you were here last week? So you already know the way, right? And the folks that will be in the fellowship hall are already smiling, waiting to feed you and to have conversation with you. If you have any questions along the way, just look for one of us. Some are standing up on top of the balcony, some in the back. Whatever you need, if we are able to do it, it's yours.
Thank you so much. We love to tell the story of how we met because most people look at us going, "You met where?" We met on the streets of Jerusalem. Oh, I'm getting a lot of echo. I must have been too quiet during sound test. We met in the streets of Jerusalem. We were both in our first year of graduate school. I was starting seminary. My wife, who earned a master's in Jewish education, was there for her first year because the expectation is that we spend the first year living and studying in Jerusalem. And so we were brand new students, and we even can tell you the corner where we met. It's the corner of Lincoln and Washington Streets, because that's the way it's pronounced in the Hebrew. In Jerusalem, right down the street from what is known as the YMCA, the YMCA, in Jerusalem. So we had the chance to be back there last summer, and we're getting to go back again this coming summer, and we always make a pilgrimage to the corner, because that was just a few years ago. Just a few years ago. We're getting ready to celebrate 33 years in December. So just before we start, I feel like I'm yelling. Just before we start, some basic ground rules, I guess is the way that I would put it, is I'm here to teach you and I want to know what you want to know. I brought my material and I'm prepared to go ahead and teach, but I also hope that you will challenge me, argue with me, help me look at something in a way that maybe I haven't done before. The other thing is to say is, go ahead and ask your questions. Because if you have the question, somebody else probably does, right? And I have been speaking to groups, interfaith groups over the years. I have been asked every question I could possibly imagine, and a few that I probably couldn't have never have imagined. I will not be insulted, right? Better that you ask and you understand. All I ever ask in return is, I may change the question that you're asking because the question you ask may not be relevant to ask somebody who's Jewish, right? And so there may be an assumption or something in the question that's not quite fair for me. So I change it up sometimes in terms of, you don't get your question answered exactly, but you get the question you were trying to ask answered, or the closest equivalent that I can give you. Okay? Does that sound fair? Okay. I appreciate the fact that they are being invited and being able to be included, and I also want to start off with the fact that if I use a Hebrew word and I don't remember to define it, stop me, right? The Hebrew for me is a second language. I am not perfectly fluent. I can get around in Israel. My biblical Hebrew and grammar is far better, but I don't always hear the fact that I'm using a technical term that's a Hebrew term. It all just sounds the same. Okay. So when we start out, you're talking about, last week you were talking about, I'm trying to remember, I saw the topic. Lament. So what I thought we would do is we would look at, I brought you two texts to look at today. Two actually texts that are hard to say favorites, but I think important to me. Psalm 88 and the second chapter of the book of Jonah. No, now that you've all picked it up, it's not what I want to start with. What I want to start with is we have to put all that material into context for you, or I want you to put it into a Jewish context so you understand where it comes from. So I entitled this as Despair and Reconciliation in the Tanakh. Well, that first part of the title there, the last word should probably be defined for all of you. When I say the Hebrew word Tanakh, Tanakh is an acronym, and it goes to the three parts that make up the Hebrew Bible. So you might translate this and say despair and reconciliation in the Hebrew Bible. But what I wanted to point out to you, and why I gave you the sheet about the Hebrew Bible, is the fact that the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament are not the same thing. Okay? They are the same materials, but they are put together in a different fashion. And the reason they're put together from a Jewish perspective is also important. So when we talk about Tanakh, that acronym, it stands for three Hebrew words: Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. The three parts of the Hebrew Bible. Torah being the first 5 books of Moses. The second being the works of the prophets. So it's Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and all the way through the end of Malachi. And then the last section are known as the writings. That starts with Psalms, Proverbs, and goes all the way through some of the other historical books, including 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Right? The difference is between an Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible is the sections that in the Hebrew Bible had to do with when they were canonized, right? So, and here's my first proviso. I am not speaking on behalf of all Judaism. I am teaching you from the point of view from which I come, which is the liberal side of Judaism. right? I understand what my Orthodox colleagues teach, but I take the same way as I imagine, or I hope you understand the difference between some of the various Protestant groups that exist, right? Or even we should say within the Lutheran churches that exist, right? Because I know that somebody from the Missouri Synod would not like the way I read Bible. I'm okay with that. So we talk about the fact that they were canonized. It is believed that somewhere around 440 BCE was when the 5 books of Moses were canonized. The reason, at that point, they made the decision to actually make it the 5 books. Because we actually know that there was an argument as to whether it should be the 4 books of Moses, the 5 books of Moses, or the 6 books of Torah, right? And they ended up choosing 5. The question is, what were the other 2 about, right? The first version, which said only used the 4 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, did so because that's the entire story of the Exodus from Egypt and getting to the entrance to the Promised Land. The book of Deuteronomy itself doesn't add anything to the narrative in terms of moving the story along, right? Deuteronomy, the second telling from the Greek, right? Moses repeats for the people all of the things that they should have known from before, as well as all of his final speeches to the people, and then his death. That's the entirety of the book of Deuteronomy. So one group said, no, we should end it with the end of Moses' life, the end of Deuteronomy. Another group said, no, you're absolutely wrong, because what is the whole point of Torah? The point of Torah is about the covenant made between God and the people of Israel. And the covenant does not get fulfilled until the book of Joshua, when the people actually enter the land. And so therefore it should be 6 books, right? And I think the technical term is a hexateuch, as a 6-book Torah. In the end, they decided on 5, right? I was not at the discussion, so I don't know exactly why they chose it that way. But we do know that conversation had, and that was about 2,500 years ago. The second section, starting with the book of Joshua all the way through the end of the book of Malachi, we think that there's a little less data here. We think most of that material was written somewhere between the end of the Torah being written and being completed somewhere around 250-ish BCE. And Malachi comes to the famous ending of Malachi is that this brings to a close the age of prophecy, right? So that's why he's the very last book. We'll talk a little bit more about the section of the prophets in a little while. The last section, the writings, are all the materials that no one argues about their origin. They are all of human origin, right? They are the books, and this doesn't matter whether you're fundamentalist or not, you may argue over who the author is, but you acknowledge the fact that they are all human authorship. So for example, the Psalms, right? David is given credit for most of the Psalms, right? Solomon is given credit for Song of Songs and Proverbs and some of the other the wisdom materials, right? But the clear understanding is all of them are of human origin. We also kind of break it up, so those are the 3 parts. They also break up to some extent in terms of the relationship or what we are supposed to get from them to an extent. Torah from a Jewish perspective is considered the holiest, right? And so when we talk about doing something that is Torah-based, it is considered given the most status. Judaism teaches that we live in relationship with God by commandments, right? And that in the 5 books of Moses, there are no less than 613 separate commandments that are left for us as Jews to fill, right? Of those commandments, We talk about the same 10 that you talk about. Our ordering is a little bit different, right? But then again, our ordering is different than your ordering, which is different than the Catholic's ordering, right? All the same material, right? The only difference with the Jewish 10 Commandments is the first commandment is technically not a commandment. Right? It's actually the introductory line to it, which reads, "I am the Lord your God who led you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage." Right? The reason that's included as the first commandment, and just as a side note, in Hebrew, the word, it actually translates as the 10 words, or the 10 things, not the 10 commandments. Because the first one is there because it explains why all the other ones are necessary. Right? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. We live in relationship with this God, and therefore what I command you to do, everything that follows, you do because of our relationship, right? And so that's that's very important for us to be able to include, because it says, and here's the why, because it's all about that covenantal, living out that covenantal relationship with God. So traditional views say Torah was given to God, was dictated to Moses by God on Mount Sinai. I do believe that there was a Sinai event, that something happened. Do I believe the book we have today is exactly word for word what was dictated to God on Mount Sinai? No. I believe it went through human hands and with no malfeasance whatsoever. But there were things that were changed as people retold the story or wrote it down in their version, because anything is like when you talk about the crime dramas and you have witnesses who all see the same event. Do any two of them report it exactly the same way? Well, usually when they report it exactly the same way, they say, okay, they've rehearsed their stories in advance, right? And this is they're covering something up, right? Because we don't. That's not the human way to do it. And so there is this tendency to have slightly different versions for it. I'm not going to remember where we were. So the idea is that comes from God. Torah is given by God. God becomes the origin or the inspiration for all the material that comes out of the 5 books. Okay? The books of the prophets. The books of the prophets are all God speaking, but not speaking directly to Moses. This is God speaking through the prophets themselves in response to particular things that are going on in the world. Right? How do the prophets communicate with God? They get a vision, they have a dream, not the same face-to-face relationship that God had with Moses. It's one step more removed than Torah. So therefore, the books themselves are said, these are hugely important, but they don't stand on the same level as Torah because they don't come from that face-to-face relationship with God. So let's look at the third section, the writings. What do you notice that's in common with all the works of the writings? Well, I told you one part of it was there's no argument that they're all human, right? So what are some of these books about? Some of the Psalms are prayers to God, right? Are praises of God. How about we take some of the other books outside the Psalms and Proverbs? What do we do with Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Esther and Ruth?
I think they feel a lot of people's response to what is happening.
Right. They are responses to what is happening. They are also, I think, an attempt to try and understand what does it mean to live in relationship with God. right? Because the world doesn't work perfectly, right? So we see things happen that our logic says, if the world was truly fair, it shouldn't work like this. But we see it working in a way that doesn't make sense. So how do we deal with it? We struggle with it. What do we do about the question of suffering? Right? All of these are themes that are raised by this third section. And so it's not about what God tells us to do, but it's about how do we live that out. Right? It's all about directing us to say, we understand what the rules, the relationship is, or what the rules and relationships are. But we struggle. Life doesn't always go as perfectly as we might like it to be. And I would argue that some of the books, especially books like the book of Job, is actually a reaction to some of the books of the theology of what were given in a lot of the Torah, right? What I mean by that, and then we should probably move on, is much of what we are taught from Torah comes down to what is referred to as Deuteronomistic history. It is this concept that if you do good things, you will be rewarded. If you do bad things, you will be punished. Right? That's very much a part of Western faith, that idea. Right? We sit here today and we say, okay, we know that that's not the way the world works. Right? My question to you is, how many of you in a moment of challenge and when something bad has happened have asked, what did I do to deserve this? That question is Deuteronomistic history, is saying, I did something to deserve this. Right? I would like to argue that the book of Job is actually a response to that theology and says, it's a nice theology, but that's not the way we see the world work. Right? We simply see the fact that sometimes suffering happens and it doesn't make sense. Right? And so therefore it was kicking back and saying, okay, we understand where you're coming from, but that doesn't necessarily work in the real world. So when we talk about Tanakh, we're talking about these materials in these three sections. So so that's the first part. I've given you the layout and all of the books in their order, including their Hebrew names. One of the things I just want to point out is under the prophets, after Ezekiel, you'll notice that there's something that's marked as the 12. These are the 12 gentlemen, and they are all gentlemen, with the unusual names, who all have short books, right? They're called the 12 because they're all relatively short books. They're called the minor prophets, not because they're any less important, but just because the length of their books is significantly shorter, right? You have a book like Jonah, which we're going to look at, which has 4 chapters, right? Compared to Isaiah, who is 90-something, right? They are both really relevant and interesting, but they're considered very different. Next thing we should talk about is one of the challenges we'll have, and I am giving you Jewish translations to all of these texts, is the way you will find the text. I guess the best word is, I'm probably making it up, versification. Is that really a word? I don't know. Versification, the way the text is broken up into verses, is somewhat different depending on your tradition. So, for example, when we look at the Psalm, what's considered in the Hebrew Bible, the very first verse, in many Christian Bibles is considered the introduction, and then verse 1 is considered, what we'll read as verse 2 is considered verse 1. Right? So I learned this the hard way because I was teaching about a particular text, and somebody, a pastor friend of mine, went and said, I was looking for that text, and when I went back to my Bible, he says, it was actually verse 9, not verse 10. Right? And then we sat down and looked at the two versions that we were using, and we noticed that the versification was different. How they counted the verses was different. So I will freely acknowledge that I am giving you Jewish translations and Jewish versification, so if it doesn't match, I'm sorry. Last thing before we get into one of the texts is the idea of translation. One of the reasons I brought this particular translation, and the translation we're using is the translation of the Jewish Publication Society, 2006. The reason I like this translation is, how many of you know the history of the translations that you use? Yeah. So let's go back, let's take something as simple as the old King James Version. Okay? Where did the old King James Version come from? Well, it came from England, yes. But not to break it to give you the bad news, hopefully it's not brand new to you, right? 5 books of Moses weren't written in English. Right? Right. Right, so just the King James Version is the Latin translation of the Greek translation of the Hebrew. Okay? I keep near my desk, there's a biblical translation called the Jerusalem Bible, a Christian, it's beautiful, right? The way they have done it, the poetry is, I've always really enjoyed it. But if you look at the history of that, that's the English translation of the French translation of the Latin translation of the Greek translation of the Hebrew. Right? Again, not saying that anybody did anything wrong, but pointing out the simple fact that anytime you translate from one language to another, you are doing, that is an act of interpretation. Right? And that when you have interpreted something 6 times to get to the Jerusalem Bible, that there can be some variance between what the original text says and what the translation says. It's not wrong. It's just different. Okay? And so my attempt is always to go back to the original, which is what this does as best it can. Part of what we will talk about is some of the challenges that exist with even with translating the Hebrew, because the honest answer is there are certain words that are in the material that we're going to look at that scholars have spent thousands of years trying to figure out, and they still don't have an answer, right? The difference is I can look at that and say, okay, we don't know for sure. Here are a couple of ideas. So talking about lament, despair. Or should let me stop for just before I dive into the next section. Any questions you want to ask between? All right? Because if you don't stop me, I will just keep going. Right? It's the teacher in me. So I brought a psalm. How many of you have ever read this psalm before? Anybody read this psalm before? Yeah, most of the time when I do this with a group, people look at me and go, okay, we've never read Psalm 88 before. And by the time we finish reading it, a lot of people go, okay, now I understand why I never read it. Right? But I bring it, and I bring it for a very specific reason. But what I do want to do at the very beginning is I want to give you just a flavor of what the Hebrew timbre is like. Right? I don't expect you to be able to translate it, but to be able to hear the way the Hebrew sounds. Because remember that this was written as biblical poetry in the Hebrew and has a particular kind of tempo to it. שיר למזמור לבנות קורח למנצח, המחלת לענות, משכיל להימן האזרחי. אדוני אלוהי ישועתי, יום זעקתי בלילה נגדך. תבוא לפניך תפילתי, חית אוזניך לבנינתי. כי שבעה ורעות נפשי, וחיי לשאול הגיעו. נחשבתי על יורי דבור, והייתי כנגד עין אייל. Okay, I won't keep going because but I hope you get a sense of the rhythm that kind of is natural part of the text. So let's go back and let's start reading 88. Would somebody read for us? Please. Just make it nice and loud so everybody can.
Oh, everybody can always hear me. I never have a problem with that.
So I'm just going to ask you, do you want to read it? Let's go through and read it all the way through, and then we'll go back and we'll talk. Or it's kind of long. No, maybe we should stop and do it bit by bit.
Tell me when to stop.
Let's stop. Just do the first 3 verses.
Okay. A song of praise for the leader on Mahalat, Lemah, and Maskell of Henam the Ezrahite. O Lord, God of my deliverance, when I cried out in the night before you, let my prayer reach you, incline your ear to hear my cry.
That's fine. Perfect. Just there. Because the text changes after that. So what do we learn so far, right? What's this first verse? Well, no, it tells us it's a song, right? It tells us more. What does it tell us? Well, let's stick with just what with the information we get in the first verse. It's a psalm of the Korathites. Who were the Korathites? Right? Korathites were part of the tribe of Levi, right? They were, hang on, let me take that back. They were actually part of the family of Aaron, right? Because hold it. No, I'm getting myself backwards. I should follow. Levi had 3 sons, right? Each of those sons had different responsibilities that were given to them for taking care of the tabernacle in the desert, right? The Korathites were one of those 3. Korath was one of the 3 sons, right? So what are they telling? That this is a specific song that is written just for this particular group to deliver, right? For the leader on Mahalat Le'enoth, right? The answer is, we're not sure. It is the Mahalat Le'enot, Mahalat, one possible reading is that this is done when somebody is sick, in response to a sickness. Machalak, the Hebrew word, can be illness, right? La'anot is the verb to answer, so it is in response to illness. But the honest part of it is we're not completely sure. And then we get even more specific. A maskil of Heman the Ezrahite. Right? Maskil comes from a talented, an educated, somebody who knew what they were doing. Right? And then it speaks of this particular gentleman, right? Heman, right? And we do know that he exists, that this character actually exists. We read about this character in the book of First Chronicles in chapter 25, they make mention of this particular character. What's interesting is this is the only one of 150 Psalms where he's mentioned by name. Right? And I always wonder why. Right? Why does it tell us this when it doesn't say that about a lot of other things? Why does it give us this little niblet of information? And the answer is we don't know yet, and we may never know. But this is the idea that these are really specific instructions, right? Here's a song that you might use in response to being sick. It is to be done by just a particular group of the Levitical tribe whose responsibilities probably included music. And it's this particular guy's song, right? It's almost like going to see some of the opera stars who specialize in, this is the aria they do really well, right? Heman does this psalm, apparently, really well. Okay. Now let's go into that's all the introduction. That's what I say. That would, in many Bibles, you would find that would be left as part of the introduction, and where we start verse 2 would be where verse 1, you would have verse 1. So, O Lord, my God of deliverance, when I cry out in night before you, let my prayer reach you. Incline your ear to my cry. What's being asked for? Listen to me, right? Hear my prayer. Right? I am singing out in song to you, asking for you to respond. Right? I want you to be responsive to me. Keep that in mind as we continue on with the text. Would somebody go ahead and do verses 4 through 6? Please.
Abandoned among the dead, like bodies lying in the grave, of whom you are mindful no more, and who are cut off from your care.
Perfect. So God listened to me, but who am I? I'm a worm. I am almost as if I am dead. Right? Think about some of the words. I am sated with misfortune. Right? I am at the brink of Sheol. Sheol, right? On the edge of death. This is the same word that is used in the 23rd Psalm, right? For the edge of death, the valley of the shadow of death. Same word here. I'm in a lousy place. I am numbered with those who go down to the pit, another reference to death. I am a helpless man, a man abandoned among the dead like bodies lying in the grave, whom you are mindful no more, who are cut off from your care. What do you see here? Hopelessness. Right? God, I want you to hear me, but I'm hopeless? You've forgotten me.
Curious why "your" is capitalized.
In which verse are you referring to? Your care?
Yes.
Because it's the reference is the capital Y here is a reference to God's care.
So just like we would capitalize Savior if it's pointing to
Correct. Your care. This is a reference. This is saying that this is a reference to God. Right. I am cut off from your care. Right. Why am I almost dead? Right. interesting thing here when it uses the word abandon. Fascinating, in the book of Job, which I made reference to before, this exact same word is used in chapter 3 of Job, when it talks about being abandoned, being dead, right? Why? What happens when we die? The relationship with God changes, right? I mentioned a little while ago that as Jews we teach that we live in a covenantal relationship with God. Well, the key word there is we live in a covenantal relationship with God. We say that there are commandments we are expected to do. Once you've died, you no longer have those obligations to God. Right? Because the dead don't do. Right? It's not saying that God cuts you off and there's no relationship. That's a whole separate conversation. But it is this concept of it's as if I am dead and I am no longer in relationship with you. Right? How low can you go? Right? In some ways, one of the reasons I like this psalm is because it takes you this far down. Right? Anything else that strikes you on these verses? How are we doing on time? We're doing fine. Right? Any other thoughts, or should we keep going? Let's keep going. Would somebody go ahead and do 7 and 8?
May I?
Please.
You have put me at the bottom of the pit, in the darkest places, in the depths. Your fury lies heavy upon me. You afflict me with all your great Selah.
Okay. So let's start by talking about that word Selah, the very end of verse 8. This is another one of those words that in the Hebrew leads us to tie it back to the very first word, a song, right? Selah is a word that appears, interestingly enough, only in the book of Psalms and only one other place in biblical material. It appears in the Psalm of Habakkuk, which is actually in the book of Habakkuk. But other than that, you only see it in the book of Psalms. Now, Selah is most likely a musicological word, and it appears at major junctions where a melody is going to change or some difference is going to occur in the text, right? And it is the Septuagint, the Greek translates it as an interlude, right? Maybe we take that as a pregnant pause, right? There's some time, there's something that happens. Yes?
Does anybody think it might refer to a refrain or something? I mean, sometimes in the church's use of the Psalms, you sometimes use a refrain.
Yes, and that actually comes from the ancient biblical scholar Jerome.
Okay.
Jerome translated Selah, his understanding of it was always. Right? And so the idea was you get to this point always, and that takes you back to the refrain.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right? And so that's where that idea comes from, but it is only from Jerome.
Right, that's his understanding.
Right, it's his understanding of it, which by Jewish experience is a relatively recent material. Right? Not to say that it's interesting and I know it and I've learned it and I've studied it, but it's interesting that it was, the honest answer is we're not completely sure exactly what purpose it was used for. But there are any number of possibilities. But the fact that it's that musicological, because I want you to think as we go through this is not a toe-tapping number. Right? So let's go, we've done the Selah. What else do we see? What else do we see in verses 7 and 8? Thank you. Where does the responsibility for everything that's gone wrong lie? You did this to me. Right. You put me in the pit. You have done this to me. Here the psalmist is getting angry at God. Do we normally think of a biblical text telling us that you can get angry with God? Remember, they chose to include this material, right? They left it in, right? So the author here is telling us that I'm angry at God for what God did to me, right? How do we make sense with that and with the start of the psalm? Listen to my cry. How do we make those two work together? Okay, maybe I'm begging for mercy. I've had enough. Right? Maybe this is a bit of Job. I don't know why I'm suffering, but you're making me suffer. Absolutely. It is that temper tantrum. You know, going back to, remember, we talked about the Deuteronomistic history, right? I didn't do something to deserve it, so why am I suffering? I didn't do it. You did it to me, right?
Isn't the first part of sorrow or whatever when something happens, the first thing is you get angry?
Mm-hmm. Right, but I'm thinking here at the beginning it says, God listened to me, right?
In the beginning, yes.
Right?
You get angry.
Right, but then, listen to me, I want you to listen to me that I'm getting angry at you. I don't know, when your children try that, it's usually not particularly effective, right?
Maybe, I kind of read into this as he feels it like a test of faith. Something happened and he thinks maybe God is testing him.
But what is it saying about God's test? It is painful. Yes. Let's be honest. We'll call it what it is. This is saying this sucks. Right? But what else? What else are they saying? What else is the author challenging? If we take that idea that maybe it is a test, it's not a fair test. So you may test me, but why? I'm pissed off that you're testing me and I didn't do anything to deserve it. Yeah. I'm angry.
I was just going to mention, do you not see that with Moses and with Elijah coming to God and saying, hey, I don't want to be here. You step in here.
Right. Well, let's be honest, most of the prophets, are reluctant prophets. None of them say, choose me. Right? They all say, no, go find somebody else. Why? Because it's a job, it's a pretty lousy job. Right? And we'll come back to that when we get to the second text and talk about the prophet Jonah. Because he's the reluctant prophet to the extreme. Right? Right? So you're absolutely right. We have seen other people in this place. So I want to keep going because I could get lost in this text for a long, long time.
What are breakers?
In terms of, it talks about with all your breakers, it's believed that that's another reference to death. The same way as pit and Sheol and we're you're throwing me into death. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But but the idea of, excuse me, the idea of what happens to the breakers? The breakers are often, at least in the English term we use, where the rocks that take most of the brunt, the force of a wave, right? So you're putting me in harm's way.
Plus, once you get beyond the breakers, you're going after ships.
Right. Those are the last defense in terms of the safe harbor. Right? Right. Or as you're coming in, it's the first defense, I guess, of the safe harbor. So it's the riskiest position. Right? So let's keep going. Let's do 9 through 11 because we have another Selah there, which we'll take that as a transition moment. We'll use it as a transition moment.
You make my companions shun me. You make me abhorrent to them. I am shut in and do not go out. My eyes pine away from affliction. I call to you, O Lord, each day. I stretch out my hands to you. Do you work wonders for the dead? Do the shades rise to praise you? Selah.
Okay. What's the psalmist saying?
I hear it as I'm so low that you have to work wonders to help me out.
I am so far down that I think to some extent almost I'm as good as dead because, do you work wonders for the dead?
Yeah, you have to work wonders to bring me back.
Mm-hmm. That's how far down I've gone. That's how bad things are for me that it would take a miracle to get me out of here. Right? People have shunned me like I no longer exist. Right? It is a sort of death without having died. Right? It's as bad as death. I heard somebody say that. Right. It's as bad as death. Right? It would take a miracle for me to get out of this alive. Right?
Every day and you're not answering.
Right. I'm still reaching, but and we'll talk about why I brought this once we get to the end of the text.
At this point, I think he almost starts to turn the tables on God when he says, do you work wonders for the dead, do the shades rise to praise you? If I'm as good as dead, who's going to be left to praise you? What good is that to you?
Let's hold on to that, and let's go into the next verses because that follows through even more so. So would somebody go and do 12 through 14? Beneficent. Okay. Right? So following along with what you're saying is, if you kill me, what's going to happen? If I'm dead, I will no longer be able to pray to you. I will no longer be able to praise you. I will no longer be able to reach out to you. What good am I to you if I'm dead? Right? So here, most definitely turning the tables on God, right? And saying, hang on, you may be doing this to me, but you need me too, right? Because the dead don't praise, right? And so therefore, it raises a really interesting theological question too, doesn't it? Right? Because we always, all the time we talk about how we need God. Do we ever stop to ask the question in reverse? Does God need us? The psalmist here is actually making an argument that yes, God does. Absolutely, that's exactly. Relationship requires two sides, right? But it's a real, I think the way he does it is fascinating to raise that question of the idea of, we always talk about us needing God, but does God need us? And the psalmist here challenges us and says, I think you do. Okay. Let's finish the psalm and then talk about why I made you go through this beautifully depressing text. So what does the psalmist tell us at the end here? From my youth I have been afflicted and near death. Right? This is not a new occurrence. Right? This is not like one particular moment happened and I'm coming to you and saying, you've forgotten me. We've got a history together. Right? All life long, this has been like this. What question are they asking? Why? Right? Why do I have to suffer? Right? Why? Right? Good question, but why? And what happens here towards the end? What else? What's missing, by the way? You're absolutely correct. It lacks the happy ending. There's a Hebrew phrase for that called a nechemta, which is many of the times when we read from the books of the prophets, it raises this idea that at the end it always tries to end on an up note. This one doesn't. But I think there's actually something else missing besides the happy ending. There's certainly no answer. No, there's certainly, to some extent, I would say that there's a lack of hope. Right, I think there is hope in there, but it's a very slightly different kind of hope. No, I'm talking here about, tell me more about the person who wrote the psalm. Alone, no friends, no family.
He doesn't realize that he has a relationship with God. He thinks God's forgotten him.
Well, I believe, I thought we had a relationship, but I don't seem to see one happening. Right? Now, think now and compare what we've read so far and the visit of Job's friends when they come to see him. What do the friends all tell Job? It's your fault. Right? They start off, right? And first of all, I would argue that if those are your friends, find new friends. But they all say, it's your fault. You did something to deserve it. What's lacking in the psalmist? It's your fault.
He doesn't see any fault in himself.
Right. There's no fault in me. I didn't do anything to deserve this. You're doing all of this to me. I'm not acknowledging sin or transgression. I'm saying all of this is unwarranted. Right? You're doing this to me. I'm the victim. Right? So why do I bring this psalm to you? This is not the one you're going to pick up and read and say, I need to feel a little bit better. Let's go read Psalm 88. Right? This is the psalm you say, I'm feeling way too good. I want to be depressed. So I'm going to read Psalm 88. Mm-hmm. Our world is, in some ways, feels like that. We can feel distant.
Maybe you will think, well, if you think you got it bad, look at this guy.
You're on the edge of getting up.
Mm-hmm.
Just like, the next thing I almost think about was if I was talking to this person, the next thing would be suicide.
Right. This is the person that you might call and say, I'm worried about them hurting themselves.
He's expressed his anger. He says, you've done it to me. You've cherished this from me. And I'm at the bottom. There's nothing else.
There are also people in this world that are on the receiving end of things that are not deserved. And that's been part of our theme as well.
Right. Things happen to people that are not deserved. The world doesn't work according to the response that says if you do good, you'll be rewarded. If you do bad, you're going to be punished. We know that's not the way the world works. Right? I was taught this psalm when I was doing my training in hospital chaplaincy. This became one of my favorite psalms to use with people at bedside. Why?
You're not the only one. Building relationships. Somebody else felt like you did.
You are not the first person to be feeling like you do in this moment. What else? We're given permission to do that. How many times do we say, does somebody talk about the fact that I'm angry with God, and they feel that they don't have a right to be angry with God? The psalm gives us permission, right? It's saying you are human. You're allowed to be human. You're allowed to have that response, right? Sure, we aim to do our better selves, but at the same time, when things are bad, not outlandish. What else? So it's given us permission. It's given us the idea that we're not the first person to be angry with God. Right?
From time to time in my life, I have found myself praying Psalm 18, simply because things have gotten so, when things get really crappy, at some point, to be able to say to God, look, if you are the God of life, like you say you are, and you are the God that brings things out of, that brings something out of nothing,
Mm-hmm.
like you say you are, what about me? And there is some kind of hope that I find, because I think to myself, okay, maybe this story isn't over.
Right. That's all. Right? And that's why when before somebody said, what was this psalm lacking? They said it lacks hope. And I said, it does lack hope on a very basic level. Right? But at the same time, I think it is also a psalm that is full of hope. Right? Because, let's be honest, if things had been totally bad, we wouldn't have it. Right? We have the psalm. Somebody kept it for us, right? And they kept it for us for a reason. They kept for us to say that despair happens in life. Bad things occur. You're not the only one who's ever felt this way. It's okay to feel that way. You're not alone. You haven't been forgotten. It is a psalm that is sad and depressing, yet at the same time it reminds us that of everything else we need to have, we really need to have hope that the relationship will continue to carry on. And so I've used it with people who are sitting in exactly that same situation and said, I'm not saying what you're going through is okay. What I'm telling you is that you're not alone.
Reminds me of a book I read years ago, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People?
Harold Kushner. Right. Rabbi Kushner's argument, Rabbi Kushner wrote this book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, and tries to debate the issue of how do we believe the concept that we want to have different beliefs about God, and if we try to believe all of them at the same time, they don't mesh. His argument is that in general we want to believe that God is all-powerful, that God is all-knowing, and that God is all-loving. He says you can't have all three of those things happening at the same time and the world be the way that it is. Right? He uses the book of Job as part of his explanation, but and I had the honor of knowing Rabbi Kushner, an amazing man, an amazing speaker, and even in some ways more amazing was his wife. We got to be friendly with her they were scholars that we worked with for a little while, and she's heard this same lecture hundreds of times, right? But because it all starts with their child, the book was written because a child of theirs suffered from progeria, rapid aging, and died very, very young. And this was his attempt to try and figure out what works in the world. I love most of it. My biggest problem is his argument in the end is that God can't be all three of those things. All-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving, all at the same time. I have difficulty with us as human beings saying, I'm going to limit what God can do. Because his argument is, well, therefore, God must not be all-powerful because we want to believe that God is all-knowing. And let's be honest, who wants to believe in a God that's not all-loving? So which of the three basic principles that we hold are up for debate? All-powerful. And he argues that therefore God must not be seen as all-powerful. I take that as a little bit of, to use a good Yiddish term, that's a little bit of chutzpah. And I've had this conversation with Rabbi Kushner. It was, who are you to tell me what God can't do? Right? I tend to tweak a little bit of his theology, and I say that God must choose not to act as all-powerful, because the moment God overrides our actions, we lose free will. Right? So I have to believe in a God that lets bad things happen because somebody else made them happen, or sometimes just because stuff happens, because I want to believe in a God that has the power, but interestingly enough, out of love, has to let us suffer that. Right? Right. Right. And sometimes the only way we learn the lessons are learned are by feeling them the hard way, right? And so it's fascinating. I am so grateful that this psalm is in the Psalter, right? When I was in seminary at Vinical School, part of what we studied was not rabbi. He's a rabbi to me because he's one of my teachers. He was a teacher. Brueggemann was a scholar on the Psalms, and his scholarship on the Psalms to this day continues to affect the way that we look at things. And he talks about this psalm falls into his category of what we call psalms of disorientation, right? And I am so grateful that the psalmists included this material and didn't whitewash life to such a point to say, oh, it's all going to be pleasant, wonderful, and it's all going to work out in the end. Answer is, we don't know. We strive, we suffer, we have things happen to us, but at the same time, we don't walk through this alone. That should bring us, I think, to the end of our first half, and I hope hopefully we'll have some more time to talk about the book of Jonah during our second section.
So if you weren't here last week or so, you just exit out the back, make your way to the left, and there's stairs and an elevator, and downstairs, and you'll find refreshments and a bit to eat.